Page 20. Literary theorizing from Aristotle to Lewis. Some key moments, para. So far I have perhaps given the impression that theoretical positions about literature were never explicitly formulated by liberal humanists, at least in Britain, and that everything remained implicit. Yet a widely current body of theoretical work existed from the start within English studies, and references were often made to it in books and essays. The average student or teacher of Eng Lit up to the 1970s would probably have had a fairly limited direct contact with this, page 21, body of work, since the whole thrust of the subject was away from this kind of generalized position-taking, para. What then constituted the body of theory about literature that has existed for many centuries as an available underpinning for the study of literature, even if literary students seldom had any extensive first-hand acquaintance with it? Well, the material goes back to Greek and Latin originals. Critical theory, in fact, long predates the literary criticism of individual works. The earliest work of theory was Aristotle's Poetics (4th century BC), which, in spite of its title, is about the nature of literature itself. Aristotle offers famous definition of tragedy, insists that literature is about character, and that character is revealed through action, and he tries to identify the required stages in the progress of a plot. Aristotle was also the first critic to develop a reader-centered approach to literature, since his consideration of drama tried to describe how it affected the audience. Tragedy, he said, should stimulate the emotions of pity and fear, these being roughly sympathy for and empathy with the plight of the protagonist. By the combination of these emotions came about the effect Aristotle called catharsis, quote, catharsis, unquote, comma, whereby these emotions are exercised rather than exorcised as the audience identifies with the plight of the central character. Para. The first prestigious name in English writing about literature is that of Sir Philip Sidney, Sidney, who wrote his Apology for Poetry in about 1580. Sidney was intent on expanding the implications of the ancient definition of literature first formulated by the Latin poet Ovid, 43 BC to AD 17, who had said that its mission is, quote, dicere delictendo, docere, D-O-C-E-R-E, delictendo, D-E-L-I-C-T-E-N-D-O, unquote, to teach by delighting, D-E-L-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, bracket, meaning approximately by entertaining, bracket closed. Sidney also quotes Horace, 65 to 8 BC, to the effect that a poem is a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. Thus, the giving of pleasure is here allowed a central position in the reading of literature, unlike, say, philosophy, which is implicitly stigmatized as worthy and uplifting but not much fun. The notion of literature giving pleasure will now seem an unremarkable sentiment, but Sidney's aim was the revolutionary one of distinguishing literature from other forms of writing. On the grounds that uniquely literature has as its primary aim the giving of pleasure to the reader, and any moral or didactic element is necessarily either subordinate to that or at least unlikely to succeed without it. In a religious age deeply suspicious of all forms, page 22, of fiction, poetry, and representation, and always likely to denounce them as the work of the devil, this was a very great step to take. In English, too, then critical theory came before practical criticism, as Sidney is writing about literature in general, not about individual works or writers. Para. Literary theory after Sidney was significantly advanced by Samuel Johnson in the 18th century. Johnson's Lives of the Poets and Prefaces to Shakespeare can be seen both as another major step forward in critical theory and as the start of the English tradition of practical criticism, since he is the first to offer detailed commentary on the work of a single author. Prior to Johnson, the only text which had ever been subjected to this intensive scrutiny was the Bible and the equivalent sacred books of other religion. The extension of this practice to works other than those thoughts to be the direct product of divine inspiration marks a significant moment of progress in the development of secular humanism. Para. After Johnson came a major burgeoning of critical theory in the work of the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, and Shelley. One of the main texts is Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads. What Wordsworth wrote in this preface was the product of collaborative discussions between himself and Coleridge. The introduction was added to the second edition of the Ballads, published in 1800 after the first of 1798 had been met with puzzlement. The book blends high literature and popular literature since it contains literary ballads constructed on the model of the popular oral ballads of ordinary country people. The original readers of lyrical ballads also disliked the abandonment of the conventions of verbal decorum. These conventions had imposed a high degree of artificiality on poetic language, making it as different as possible from the language of ordinary everyday speech. Thus, a specialized poetic vocabulary had tended to enjoin the avoidance of simple everyday terms for things, and an elaborate system of rhyme and a highly compressed form of grammar had produced a verbal texture of much greater density than that of ordinary language. Suddenly, two ambitious young poets were trying to make their poetic language as much like prose as possible, avoiding the conventions of diction and verbal structure which had held sway for so long. Thus, this book is one of a number of significant critical works in literary theory, page 23, whose immediate aim is to provide a rationale for the critic's own poetic work and to educate the audience for it. It also anticipates issues of great interest to contemporary critical theory, such as the relationship between poetic language and ordinary language, and that between literature and other kinds of writing. Para. A second significant work from the Romantic era was Coleridge's misleadingly titled Biographia Literaria. The title might lead us to expect a work like Johnson's Lives of the Poets, but in fact much of it directly addresses the ideas contained in Wordsworth's preface, showing by a close consideration of aspects of his work that Wordsworth writes his best poetry when he is furthest away from adherence to his own theories of what poetry should be. Indeed, in the years during which he and Coleridge had drifted apart as friends, they had also taken radically different views about the nature of poetry. Coleridge came to disagree completely with the view that the language of poetry must strive to become more like the language of prose. He saw this as an impoverishment of the poetic effect which must ultimately prove suicidal. The argument dovetails neatly with the works already cited. If literature and other works differ in their aims and effects, as Aristotle and Sidney had maintained, and if poetry, unlike other kinds of writing, aims to teach by entertaining, then the major way in which the entertaining is done must be through the language in which it is written. The language entertains by its fictive, F-I-C-T-I-V-E, within quote, qualities. This is the source of the aesthetic effect. Something like this is also connoted in Shelley's A Defense of Poetry, 1821, which sees poetry as essentially engaged in what a group of 20th century Russian critics later called defamiliarization. Shelley anticipates this term since for him poetry, quote, strips the veil of familiarity from the world, ... It purges from our inward side the film of familiarity, ... It compels us to feel that which we perceive and to imagine that which we know, ... unquote. This remarkable critical document also anticipates T.S. Eliot's notion of impersonality, bracket, put forward in his 1919 essay, quote, Tradition and the Indian Individual Talent, unquote, bracket closed, whereby there is a distinction between bracket, as we might call it, bracket closed, the author, bracket, who is the person behind the work, bracket closed, and the writer, bracket, who is, so to speak, the person in the work, bracket closed, stop. In Eliot's view, the greater the separation between the two, the better, since, quote, the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man, page 24, who suffers, and the mind which creates, unquote, asterisk. So that poetry is not simply the conscious rendering of personal experiences into words. Shelley registers all this 100 years earlier in his characteristically magisterial prose indent. The mind in creation is as a fading coal, with some invisible influence, like an inconstant wind, awakens to transitory brightness, semicolon. This power arises from within like the color of a flower which fades and changes as it is developed, and the conscious portions of our natures are unprophetic either of its approach or of its departure, close bracket. A defense, lines 999 to 1003, my italics, bracket closed, para. There is also an anticipation here of the Freudian notion of the mind as made up of conscious and unconscious elements. Indeed, the idea of the unconscious is an essential one in Romanticism, and implicit in everything written about poetry by another major Romanticist, John Keats. Keats did not write formal literary theory in the way Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley did, but he did reflect on poetry in a sustained way in his letters. He too formulates a notion of the workings of the unconscious. For instance, in a letter to Bailey of 22 November 1817, when he speaks of how, quote, the simple imaginative mind, in capital, may have its rewards in the repetition of its own silent working, W capital, coming continually on the spirit, S capital, with a fine suddenness, stop, unquote. The, quote, silent working, unquote, of the mind is the unconscious, and the spirit into which it erupts is the conscious. Keats' idea of negative capability also amounts to this same privileges of the unconscious, this same desire to allow its scope to work, negative capability being, quote, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, unquote, bracket. Letters to his brothers, 21 December 1817, bracket closed. In the critical writings of the Romantics, then, there are many anticipations of the concerns of critical theory today. Para. After the Romantics, the main developments in critical theory were the work of mid and late Victorians George Eliot, Matthew Arnold, and Henry James. George Eliot's critical work ranges widely over classical and continental writers and philosophical issues, as did Coleridge's. It is worth emphasizing this since there are two distinct tracks in the development of English criticism. One track leads through Samuel Johnson and Matthew Arnold to T.S. Eliot and, page 25, F.R. Lewis. This might be called the practical criticism track. It tends to center upon the close analysis of the work of particular writers and gives us our familiar tradition of close reading. The other track lies through Sidney, Wordsworth, Coleridge, George Eliot, and Henry James. This track is very much ideas-led, quote, IDEAS-LED, unquote, rather than text-led. It tends to tackle big general issues concerned with literature. How are literary works structured? How do they affect readers or audiences? What is the nature of literary language? How does literature relate to the contemporary and to matters of politics and gender? What can be said about literature from a philosophical point of view? What is the nature of the act of literary composition? These track 2 preoccupations are very similar to the concerns of the critical theorists who became prominent from the 1960s onwards, and it is important to realize that these concerns are not an exotic imposition upon native Anglo-American approaches to literature, but rather have been part of it from the beginning. Para. The insistence upon close reading in the 1920s sprang partly from the work of Matthew Arnold in the previous century. Arnold has remained a key canonical figure in the history of English criticism, partly because F.R. Lewis adopted and adapted several of his ideas and attitudes and gave them 20th century currency. Arnold feared that the decline of religion would leave an increasingly divided society with no common system of beliefs, values, and images, with potentially disastrous consequences. He saw literature as a possible replacement for religion in this regard, but believed that the middle classes, on whom the burden and responsibility of democracy largely fell, had been progressively debased by materialism and Philistinism. The critic would help such people to recognize, quote, the best that has been known and thought in the world, unquote, and thus enable them to give individual assent to the canon of great works which had emerged through the collective wisdom of the ages. Para. Arnold's most significant thinking is contained in the essays, quote, the function of criticism at the present time, unquote, and, quote, the study of poetry, unquote, stop. He stresses the importance for literature of remaining disinterested, by which he means politically detached and uncommitted to any specific program of action. The goal of literary criticism is that of attaining pure, disinterested knowledge, that is, to use another of his favorite phrases of simply appreciating, page 26, quote, the object as in itself it really is, unquote, without wanting to press the insight gained into the service of a specific line of action.